Curious how equity compensation can help build employee financial confidence and move your business forward? Tune in to the latest episode of Morgan Stanley at Work's Invested at Work podcast, where we explore the power of financial benefits and how they can help your employees in the workplace and beyond. Listen now by visiting morganstanley.com/investedAtWork or stream on Apple or Spotify. Because we believe that when employees thrive, your company thrives too. Again, visit morganstanley.com/investedAtWork to listen today.
The views expressed on this podcast are those of the participants, not of Reuters News.
They need to find money for long-term capital investment. The United Kingdom is particularly weak on that front compared to other developed countries. And without the investment, there is no chance of increasing economic prosperity and economic growth.
Budget day is upon us. Next week, UK Finance Minister Rachel Reeves will unveil the first budget under her Labour government. Her task is all the more challenging, given the promises she and Prime Minister Keir Starmer made to get elected. Capital gains, inheritance and real estate taxes may all go up, but will it be enough to restore the country's creaking finances, and how will business react? These questions are the focus of this week's Viewsroom.
Welcome back to the Viewsroom, the weekly podcast that invites you, the listener, into a lively debate with our fellow columnists about the biggest stories of the week. I'm your host, Amy Donlan.
And I'm Jonathan Guilford.
So Jonathan, a tricky balancing act. This is what the UK is facing at the moment around its finances. So the government needs to replenish a big hole that has been left from years and years of underinvestment in healthcare, education, prisons, all sorts of things like that. So what we're going to see next week is the big budget. So this is like what the UK is going to spend its money on. And thankfully, we have Francesco Guerrera, our global head of economics at Breaking Views, and Neil Unmack, who is very much a debt specialist, I would say, at Breaking Views, and also an associate editor. So welcome back, Neil and Francesco.
Thank you.
So Francesco, I think Halloween is upon us. It's maybe an apt metaphor that the ghosts are haunting this budget. Liz Truss, the former Prime Minister, blew out the cost of borrowing in the UK with lots of promises of tax cuts that were unfunded. So Rachel Reeves is going to step into that chair next week. And I just wanted maybe to set the scene. There is an awful lot of talk about this funding black hole, this £40 billion. And I just wondered if you could tell our listeners, how did the government end up with it and how bad is it?
Well, there's a lot of talk about the £40 billion black hole because the government can't stop talking about it, right? So this has been literally leaked by the Labour spin doctors to all the press. That's the target that they set themselves to raise funds to not just pay for day-to-day expenditure. So we're talking about running the hospitals, running the prisons, running the normal things the government does, but also they need to find money for long-term capital investment. The United Kingdom is particularly weak on that front compared to other developed countries. And without the investment, there is no chance of increasing economic prosperity and economic growth. So the government has two tasks, which are very difficult. One has to fund through taxation, because they said they would do that through taxation, has to fund the day-to-day spending, and also has to borrow in order to fund long-term capital investment. And those are the two things that puts them between a rock and a hard place, because they need to be able to persuade people that they're not going to raise taxes too much, and business in particular, they're not going to raise taxes too much. And at the same time, they need to ensure that voters know that something is going into creating public services and also the long-term growth and prosperity of the country.
If you think about the big picture here, like what Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer are trying to achieve, obviously for the past decade and change, the whole conversation was about, let's say, the structural sustainability of the UK financial picture. And it didn't really feel like it grew out into a broader macroeconomic conversation than that. Whereas now it's very much this kind of like growth forward kind of thinking about how they want to use the budget among the other tools to turn around a flagging growth picture, right? Is that kind of where they're going at? And I'm just kind of curious as to like how the limited financial picture plays into that, when it seems like that was something that the prior series of governments was kind of leaning into. Is that, how much is that going to kind of shackle what Reeves and Starmer are trying to do right now?
Is exactly that. It's all about growth at the moment. The Labour government, which came to power only this summer, it's been talking about how the only way out for the UK is to grow its way out of the problems, including, of course, a constrained financial situation, fiscal situation. The problem is that those things take a very long time, and some of the issues that the UK faces, in particular, the state of its National Health Service, which for people who don't live in the UK, the National Health Service is the pride and joy of the country and has been in a tremendously bad state, really for many years, but really the COVID pandemic brought that to its knees. And so they need to raise money through taxation to fund that, to fund the National Health Service, to make sure that waiting lists are down, that people feel confident in this, they can be treated. So that's one thing. And then growth will come later. They have to fund growth with borrowing, as we said. But the fact is that growth in terms of the fiscal situation will take a long time to materialize. So they need to find some short-term solution and then pay for the long-term solutions as well.
If I could bring Neil, you into this conversation here, because you've been writing a lot about the different tax options that the UK has now. And I think that if you're a company, like a large business operating in the UK, I think maybe your instinct in previous Labour governments has to be a bit wary as to how they're going to raise money, how the government's going to raise money. And the obvious thing is you don't want to, I mean, Rachel Reeves has already said she's not going to raise income tax, the kind of taxes that affect, like, the broader public. So what do you think businesses are most worried about, and what are the options on the table in terms of how you might raise money from different types of companies?
There's a lot of scope for them to raise money in ways that don't frustrate business. So for example, there's a lot of talk at the moment about increasing inheritance tax, or rather removing some of the exemptions that currently exist for inheritance tax, like this wonderful rule that George Osborne introduced, whereby most pensions are exempt from inheritance tax or not counted towards people's estates. So so sort of unpicking those allowances is something that she can do, and she can raise a fair amount of money that way. Where I think business gets a bit more edgy is when she starts talking about increasing national insurance contributions, which is essentially the money that comes out of people's paychecks to pay for the pension system, and which companies make a contribution to. So increasing those contributions, or ensuring that the money that when people pay into their pension, they don't have to make those national insurance contributions, and companies don't have to. Simply saying companies must in future make them. So I think clearly there will be some measures in there that do essentially penalise companies, and that's coming at a time when the government has done other things, such as, or is promising to do other things, such as increasing regulation on employment. So a government which came to power talking about growth, and that, to be fair, they have done some things that have been very good for growth, like reforming onshore wind power and reforming planning laws, or going about trying to reform planning laws. But that sort of message that we need growth is somewhat being diluted by the weight of new regulation and taxes on business. Right. And I mean, there is leeway to do stuff that kind of steps around the need to do, kind of like you're saying, measures that business considers punitive. And part of that is just kind of changing the fiscal rules and how they treat certain forms of borrowing, right? Francesco, how much wiggle room can the government give itself through essentially just kind of changing the rule book?
Yeah, Jonathan, this is a big topic. I think what we're seeing here at a broader level, we're seeing really the dichotomy between the campaign promises of any government, of any party, and then the reality of government, in particular in a country like the UK, which has all these constraints. And the issue is that the government, when Labour was campaigning, they were talking about not touching taxes on working people. That's their wording, working people. So that excluded all the big potential tax raises, so the income taxes being the biggest one. They also talked about not increasing corporation tax, which is another big potential pool of revenue. So now they're left with this idea that they can change the fiscal rule. The fiscal rules are a construct, a pure theoretical construct the governments do to reassure markets that they're not going to go crazy in terms of borrowing. They're not supposed to be gamed. They're not supposed to be changed 2 weeks or a week before the budget in order to get, as you call, the wiggle room, which is also what the government is thinking of. So they're going about this the wrong way. The fiscal rules are there as a speed limit, right, for the government. So you don't change the speed limit every week. The government shouldn't come to the budget a week before the budget without anybody knowing what the new fiscal rules are going to be. Now, thankfully, the talk of the town is that they're going to make a very small change to these fiscal rules so that the markets are not going to be worried, much like they were when Liz Truss was in power, as Amy was saying before. And that will give them 25 billion more in extra borrowing capacity, which sounds like a lot, but it's actually not that much. And also, they'll be well advised not to use it all because the markets could get pretty jittery if they start using it all. Generally speaking, I think the government is learning the hard way that it's different, the difference between opposition being government.
I think, Francesco, that is all so interesting. And I just, again, Neil, I'm sort of curious what you think about this, because I think that the whole dance that has to happen next week is about making sure you don't spook the bond markets. So you have to try and get as much money as you can out of various different tweaks you can do to taxes. But ultimately, what you really don't want to do is do what Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss did before, which is try to do too much that the bond markets go, no, they can't afford this. This is not going to work. So how are the bond markets reacting in the lead up to the budget?
Well, I think we've seen yields rising across the board for developed market economies. I mean, as Francesco said, it looks like the changes she will make to the fiscal rules will be relatively modest, and therefore it's unlikely, I think, to trigger the same kind of reaction. It's also probably important to note the backdrop is a bit different to in 2022 with Liz Truss, right? We have expectation that central banks will be cutting rates next year. You know, a lot of what went wrong in 2022 was that you had an extremely over-leveraged pension sector which was essentially, unraveling and put into a situation of forced sales, and that's changed now. So, I think Rachel Reeves would need to be pretty radical to trigger the same kind of reaction. Also, yields are high already, so we're at 4.6, 4.7% for very long dated gilts, which is not too far off where they were already with Liz Truss.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I completely agree with Neil. I think the other thing is that, and this the government has been very, very clear, they are not going to have unfunded tax cuts. Well, first of all, they're not going to have any tax cuts. Secondly, everything that they spend, they will fund. That's the second fiscal rule that they've introduced, which is that the day-to-day spending has to be matched by corresponding tax increases. So in that respect, bond investors ought to be a lot calmer than 2 years ago.
I mean, that being said, still something of a tightrope to walk here, especially given the shifting context. I mean, just to kind of close this out, I would say we get fairly myopically focused on the big news event and what's happening in this specific budget. I mean, if you had to think about this in the broader context of the pushback for growth, right, and kind of continuing worries about, the UK equities market continues to trail, or, there's issues with house building, or et cetera, et cetera. I mean, is there anything that seems kind of unlikely to be wrapped into here that you think that business might still be pushing for, or that could still be on the horizon? I know, Neil, you wrote about kind of businesses lobbying for taxes on share transactions to be lowered or scrapped. Like, is there anything that could be a sort of out of left field surprise, either in this budget or kind of in the future, that the government might still want to be thinking about?
Yes, well, I think people have been pushing for the government to sort of take away some of the transaction tax type measures that currently exist that supposedly penalise UK share valuations. I mean, I think those kind of measures, we're just not going to see it at a time when the government is scrabbling around to try and fill a 22 billion or 40 billion or whatever you want to call it black hole. There's a limited appetite to throw freebies to the financial services sector. Probably, more meaningful things they can do to help UK stock prices is to consolidate the pension system, to make it more efficient, to increase risk taking there, and to potentially encourage domestic savers to put more money into domestic shares, for example, by giving them tax breaks in the way that other countries already do. But ultimately, there's not that much money right now, and if the growth agenda doesn't work, which it could easily not work that much, given at the moment the fact that the government is really sending mixed messages and is probably going to be raising quite a lot of taxes. If the growth measure move doesn't work, then there'll probably be even less money in future for giveaways like that.
Yeah, a very tricky situation for Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer next week. And not least because, as Francesco said, so many other governments are dealing with these situations. There are so many different deficits that need to be filled. It is interesting, definitely, for others to watch what happens in the UK next week and how the markets react. So, Neil, Francesco, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in. This podcast was produced by Katrina Hamlin in Hong Kong. And check out our new sister podcast, The Big View, on Apple Podcasts, Reuters.com, or wherever you like to listen. And for more breaking views, head to breakingviews.com.
Curious how equity compensation can help build employee financial confidence and move your business forward? Tune in to the latest episode of Morgan Stanley at Work's Invested at Work podcast, where we explore the power of financial benefits and how they can help your employees in the workplace and beyond. Listen now by visiting morganstanley.com/investedAtWork or stream on Apple or Spotify. Because we believe that when employees thrive, your company thrives too. Again, visit morganstanley.com/investedAtWork to listen today.